Thank you, Max. Good morning. It is Wednesday, May 26th, 2021. This is the virtual meeting of the Wilmington, Baltimore Avenue Streetscape Task Force. Welcome, everybody. We're going to start off with a call to order at 9 o'clock a.m. We'll start with roll call. I'm just going to go down the list alphabetical, see who's here. If you would, please raise your hand and hold it up for a few seconds, so that all those watching can recognize you. Joe Baker, not on. Jenny Burton.
Here.
Welcome, Jenny. Frank Cole.
Here.
Thank you, Frank. Frank Cooper. Not on yet. Daniel Fosnot. Daniel. Randy Haney from the Blue Moon indicated he was not able to attend today. Patty Hoffman.
I'm here.
There you go. Welcome. David Mariner. Not on yet. Andy Medic. Not on. Howard Menaker.
Here. Good morning.
Hi, Howard. Welcome. Alex Moore. Nope. Elise Moore.
I'm here, Mayor.
Hi, Elise. Welcome. Bob Pomerantz.
Here.
Hi, Bob. Welcome.
Good morning.
Commissioner Schematics.
Here, Mayor.
Commissioner Pat Caluzzi.
Here.
Mayor Stan Mills is here. I see Alex Moore just came on, and Frank Cooper's here also. So we'll try to identify others as they come aboard. That means we have a quorum of members. Majority of 16 members are present and are able to formally conduct business today. I'd also like to identify the project team members here with us today. Kevin Williams, Public Works Supervisor. City Manager Sharon Lynn, Project Coordinator Evan Miller, Executive Assistant Margaret Carson, IT Department Supervisor Max Hamby, and Womack. Again, it takes a lot of people to put on these meetings. I want to thank everybody for those that are behind the scenes to do that. I want to welcome all the watchers. Everybody's watching. We also want to thank those that have registered in advance to be able to speak today. Those are Dr. Trejos, Michael Trejos, and Mike Strange. They're familiar names to us, and we welcome you. And as usual, we will call on you at the appropriate times during the meeting to offer comment. There are no support documents embedded in the agenda today. But we do have a presentation today, rather lengthy, very extensive presentation today, and that will be embedded in the agenda for access by the public after this meeting today. So we're going to move on and start with approval of the minutes. We have 3 sets of minutes here, and I want to take them one at a time and explain why we are reconsidering 2 sets of minutes. We'll start off with the first set of minutes, which is March 31st, and that's because to be accurate, we need to remove any reference to the meeting having taken place in the caucus room, and instead it was conducted as a live streamed virtual meeting. So with that, I want to go ahead and if somebody would make a motion to reconsider approval of the minutes of March 31st as presented in front of us, please.
So moved.
Second.
So we have a motion by Howard Menaker and a second by Frank Cooper to reconsider and approve the minutes of March 31st as presented in front of us. All those in favor signify by saying aye, but hold your hand up until I say. So we got
Aye.
Alex Moore, are you okay with? Okay, so we've got the unanimous approval to reconsider and approve those minutes. Thank you very much. With that, we'll go to a reconsideration of minutes for April 7th. I'd like to see a motion that goes something like this. we'd move to reconsider approval of the minutes of April 7th, including removal of any reference to the caucus room second floor. If you notice, I left that in the header, and so I just want to make sure that what's in front of us is accurate. Howard, you want to do your thing again?
So moved, Mayor.
Frank?
Second.
Thank you. With that, we have a motion by Howard Menaker and a second by Frank Cooper to reconsider approval of the minutes of April 7th in front of us, including removal of any reference to caucus room second floor. All those in favor signify by saying aye and hold your hand up
Aye.
long enough that I can scan everybody.
Aye.
And we're all good. We're all good. Unanimously approval, and those are reconsidered and approved. Thank you very much. Moving right on, we will consider a motion to approve the minutes of April 14th that are in front of us. I would like to make two changes in that motion. One is to merely a spelling to identify Bob Suppies by his real name, Bob, instead of Bibb. I'd also, on the last page, like to identify which Frank made the mention of the desire to discuss bicycle parking. I think that was you, Frank Cooper.
Yes, I haven't watched the video for this particular set of notes, but there's also my name is misspelled on page 5. It's not capitalized. Right. Somebody hit the show.
We'll take care of any misspelling. Frank Cole, do you recall who made mention of discuss bicycle parking on the last page? I think it was Frank Cooper.
I think it was Frank Cooper. I don't recall doing that.
All righty. So we'll entertain a motion to adopt the April 4th minutes in front of us with the corrections that were noted. Howard, you want to do your thing?
So moved, Mayor.
Second.
Oh, that's very streamlined. Thank you very much. So we have a motion in front of us and a second to adopt the April 4th minutes in front of us with the corrections as noted. All those in favor signify by saying aye, holding your hand up long enough that I can scan. And we've got unanimous approval for adoption of those minutes as noted. Thank you very much. Moving right along, I want to indicate that no correspondence has been identified. The next bit of business is old business, report on receptivity by the commissioners to task force recommendations in the matters including utilization of one-way streets, limited vehicle access zones, undergrounding of utilities, and maintaining and enhancing existing traffic layout. One of the last commissioners meetings that we brought this up was April 16th, and on the agenda for the April 16th meeting of the commissioners, we talked about those 5 points and the recommendations that were made by the task force, by example, to not conduct a traffic study, to not utilize one-way streets, to utilize limited vehicle access zones only partially at the end of Wilmington, Baltimore, retain essentially the current traffic layouts and patterns and enhancing, and as a priority look into undergrounding. And all 5 of those recommendations were adopted favorably as a slate by the commissioners. Following that, there was a meeting on May 10th, and I took the liberty as chair of this committee and also as mayor to put on the agenda for May 10th in front of the commissioners an item that indicated discuss hiring an engineering consultant to advise in matters of undergrounding utilities for the Wilmington Baltimore Avenue Streetscape project. If you recall, we made that recommendation to go the undergrounding route. In conversation with our Public Works Director, Kevin Williams, and the city manager, we learned that that Rossi, as part of their job scope, is not delving very deeply into undergrounding. And so instead, the commissioners authorized the city manager to look into hiring a consultant with greater expertise, perhaps, on undergrounding that can give us some more answers. So that's all good news. And again, thank you. Pat yourselves on the back. because all those recommendations came from this group, of which you are a part. With that, we're going to go to new business. The first item of business is received from Rossi Group draft streetscape schematics retaining general roadway circulation and layout to improve pedestrian sidewalk areas, safety, and circulation. I will say that my goal today, the objective, is merely for us to listen primarily and receive all this information. I think you're going to be perhaps maybe we'll be overwhelmed with so much information. But again, the objective is to receive all this. If you have questions, probably put them down on your notepad, and we'll see if there's time at the end to ask questions. I will also note that I have 2 more meetings scheduled for June 2nd and 9th. So we're not intending at all to delve deeply into this today with discussion. That would be postponed to June 2nd, and with the focus of trying to finalize and select the path forward with this. I'm going to turn it over to Kevin Williams. I would ask that whenever Rossi or anybody uses some acronyms, they tell us what they mean, FHWA and TAP. That would be very helpful. And we see the 2 principals of Rossi are here. We welcome you all, but I'm going to turn it over to Kevin Williams.
Thanks, Mayor. I think you probably touched on all the points that need to be touched on ahead of their presentation. So we'll go straight to Alexis and have her go ahead and start with the presentation.
Much, Kevin. Let me go ahead and share my presentation here.
We need your volume up there, Alex. Go
Can you
ahead.
not hear me?
Oh, that's better.
Everybody okay? All right, go ahead, Alex.
Okay.
Alexis.
Apologies. Every platform is just a wee bit different. So go ahead and I'll get started here. So thank you guys for inviting us here today to present our Streetscape Concepts. We are in the process as Rossi Group developing these as a consultant to Delaware Department of Transportation. Delaware Department of Transportation, or DelDOT, administers Federal Highway Administration's Transportation Alternatives Program. It's known as the TAP program. Baltimore and Wilmington Avenue Streetscape Concept Development is being funded through that TAP program. As a result, our focus for the concept development will be to widen walkways for pedestrian and traffic and outdoor activities, increase safe pedestrian and bicycle travel, and provide connectivity to Rehoboth Avenue while increasing lighting and incorporating green infrastructure. So an outline for our presentation today, and I will kind of dive right in. I understand that I have quite a few slides here to present. As the mayor indicated, it's a lot of information, so it may be a little overwhelming, but if you want to hold your questions until the end, I'll do my best to respond at that point. So first, we're going to do a quick overview of the task force directions, an introduction into various elements of streetscape and streetscape design, what that means from a DelDOT engineering perspective, a review of our existing conditions assessment, a review of City of Rehoboth Beach's comprehensive development plan, and a review of our schematic concepts, what we've since developed, as well as next steps. So as the mayor indicated, in April, the task force recommended and the commission approved dropping one-way traffic schematic, retaining the limited vehicular access area on Baltimore and Wilmington Avenues, retaining enhanced current layout schematic. They recommended no traffic study at this time and to continue to consider utility undergrounding, but that's being done separately from the study. So some things to continue to keep on the table when you're considering utility undergrounding, and this is just based on conversation that Kevin Williams has had, conversations that we have had with DelDOT. But DelDOT's not going to pay for that utility undergrounding. It would have to be coordinated and executed by the city. The designing can be concurrent with the streetscape design, and it would be advanced prior to streetscape construction, similar to what's been done in Bethany Beach. So the schematics that we've developed are developed without existing utility constraints. That means that we're not holding curb lines, we're not identifying the existing utility structure as something that cannot be moved. Based on conversations by the city with Delmarva Power, Wilmington first block would need an estimated 7 transformers if they were to go from the pole mounted transformers to pad mounted surface transformers. Second block of Wilmington gets 4, and then 4 on each block of Baltimore Avenue, Baltimore Avenue. First and Second Street, based on the existing right-of-way constraints, they're simply not feasible at this point, or at least that's based on the city's conversation with Delmarva. Something else that we kind of considered in conversations with the city regarding utility undergrounding. So transformer sizes do vary between approximately 6 to 4 feet in diameter up to 10 to 8 feet, 10 by 8 feet. The preference is for pad mounted transformers to be on private property next to the right of way. And you can see a transformer here in your photo. This is on Baltimore Avenue by the Sands. On Rehoboth Avenue, where undergrounding has occurred, a lot of those transformers are located in a median. Unfortunately, we don't have the luxury of having a median as expansive and generous on Wilmington and Baltimore Avenues. Another thing to consider is when these transformers are located within 10 feet of the travel roadway, protection's needed. That includes bollards and fences. And something else to consider is while we could underground certain utilities, certainly light poles are still required throughout the corridor and wireless antennas. So some streetscape elements. And this is really just intended to be a broad overview of elements that are required and considered when we're developing our streetscape design. We looked at the DelDOT pedestrian accessibility standards and road design manual, as well as the City of Rehoboth Beach Code. So some terms worth introducing here. Obviously, I think through lanes are fairly well understood. Turn lanes, parking on either side of the roadway, and there's a variety of different parking modes, whether that's parallel parking, head-on parking, or 60-degree parking. Striped shoulders and bike lanes are different ways to accommodate for bicycle facilities, and I'll touch on that in a moment. And then our pedestrian circulation path, essentially what's known as the sidewalk. So the pedestrian circulation path is comprised of a couple different components. The buffer area is that area located immediately behind the curb. This is where signs, streetlights, fire hydrants, etc. are usually located. And it provides a separation between the moving traffic as well as space for amenities. The pedestrian access route is a safe, convenient, continuous, unobstructed pedestrian route within the right-of-way. Per ADA standards and DelDOT standards, the absolute minimum width of the pedestrian access route is 4 feet, and that's only acceptable for short spans because you would have to provide areas for individuals to pass one another. Another element of the pedestrian circulation path is the frontage zone. This is the space immediately in front of buildings when those buildings are right on the right-of-way line. So provides for door openings, staircases, things of that variety, for potentially planters or cafe seating. Bike facilities. There's a couple different ways to accommodate bikes on roads. The two that we've focused on here include the shared roadway, which would include a through lane and a striped shoulder. It's designated by bike route signs and provides continuity to other bicycle facilities along a designated preferred route. The signing and the striping help to advise the motorists to expect bicyclists. And a bike lane is established where there's a significant bicycle demand. This would include specific pavement marking and signing along the corridors, defining a specific space for preferential use by bicycles. And it helps to separate bikes from through and turn lanes. Streetscape elements. So I mentioned that we looked at DelDOT DelDOT's manuals. We also looked at the City of Rehoboth Code and other professional guidance. We have desired minimums, absolute minimum widths, which is the absolute limit to as tight as we can make an area. And then out of all of that information, we've developed our recommended minimums for this study. And that's looking at what's out there today and what, from an engineering perspective, is desired and absolutely the minimum acceptable. One thing that you'll note in the existing dimensions that we've highlighted here, so amber numbers indicate where the existing dimensions are below the desired minimum, where red indicates where existing widths are insufficient to meet the absolute minimum. And as you can see, and we'll get into that in just a moment, but there's quite a few areas where existing dimensions or existing widths are below the absolute minimum recommended. So existing conditions assessment. What we've done is we went out and we did a aerial photography GIS data review, and we measured roadway parking and sidewalk widths at sample points. This wasn't a detailed typographical or right-of-way survey, but we documented the no parking zones, fire hydrants, parking pay stations, trees, light and utility poles, sidewalk locations, conditions, etc. One thing to note in this view on Baltimore Avenue, and Baltimore and Wilmington Avenues are similar in this matter. The section closest to 2nd Street, the west side of both of these roadways, the right-of-way is narrower. So it's approximately a 50 foot width, 51 foot width. And as you get closer to the beach, that right-of-way expands out up to, I think it's 120 feet at its greatest width. Another thing to note in our typical sections here, as similar to the previous table that I introduced, we've highlighted where in red where existing widths are below absolute minimums, and in amber where the existing widths are below the recommended minimums. So again, looking at Baltimore Avenue, you're seeing the right-of-way expand out. You can accommodate more facilities within that right-of-way space, of course. And then Wilmington Avenue, again, similar to Baltimore Avenue, is set up with areas that are below the minimum widths in the section closest to 2nd Street, expanding out to a larger area, a broader expanse. 1st Street and 2nd Street are a bit different in that we've got 2 through lanes and a turn lane on both of these roadways. 1st Street also accommodates parking, and then we have the pedestrian circulation path. Now on both 1st and 2nd Street, there's areas where the pedestrian circulation path extends to the building face, which is a little outside of the existing right-of-way. So this particular section, you can see that the pedestrian circulation path extends another 57 feet, while the right-of-way is defined at 50 feet. So another look here at 1st Street, and this is down by Wilmington Avenue. And then 2nd Street. Again, 2nd Street, because it doesn't have the parking, it has broader through lanes. And just an overview of the streetscape elements again, touching on highlighting the fact that we do have areas where our existing dimensions are below the absolute and desired minimums. So our comprehensive development plan, Rossi looked at the Rehoboth Beach Comprehensive Development Plan that was developed in 2010. We understand that there's a new plan under development, but until approval of that new plan goes through, we're going to follow the 2010 CDP goals and recommendations. Of course, we're still in conversation with the city to make sure that there aren't things that are being proposed in draft form on the table that would contradict what's being proposed here today. The CDP overview, so largely it sets a goal for a green tone, assuring connectivity, walkability, safe and unrestricted pedestrian passage of all sidewalks, and streets being designed to enable safe access for all users in a citywide integrated network. Specific actions outlined in that 2010 CDP or comprehensive development plan are to upgrade both the first 2 blocks of Baltimore and Wilmington Avenues and First Street to improve commercial viability, safety, ambiance, and access to pedestrians, essentially this streetscape study. And another action was to eliminate parking on the west side of First Street for at least the first 2 blocks north of Rehoboth Avenue. So the Rehoboth Beach Bicycle and Pedestrian Plan later in 2012 called for the installation of sharrows on First and Second Streets. Out of all of these, or all of this data, Rossi Group developed some schematics. Each of these schematics is a variation on enhancing the existing layout. We've expanded travel lanes to meet the minimum requirements, as well as sidewalks. We've incorporated new elements, and we've prioritized elements or modes. And all of these schematics, as proposed today, would be able to fit within the existing right-of-way. Essentially, the schematic concepts, we've got concept 1A, which is a focus on enhancing pedestrian circulation. Concept 1B focuses on enhancing the pedestrian circulation, but also bike circulation as well. And concept 2 enhances vehicular access, which might be a little bit of a misnomer, but we've really focused on meeting the minimum requirements for the travel lanes as well as the parking areas. Common elements to all the schematic concepts. We've maintained a minimum 5-foot pedestrian circulation path. This is greater than the absolute minimum width of 4 feet, but it's less than the desired width of 8 feet in some areas. We've provided that consistent travel width throughout of 10 feet, and each schematic maximizes the use of the right-of-way again, but they all would impact parking to some degree. Schematic concept 1A, again, it expands that pedestrian circulation path to meet the minimum desired width of 8 feet, and it does not include designated bike facilities within the study area. So our typical section here, we're focusing on Baltimore Avenue, the narrowest point of the right-of-way. So this is closest to 2nd Street. What we would provide is those 2 10-foot through lanes and the 8-foot circulation path. What's left is a 7-foot essentially shoulder. Certainly as design continues, if the concept were advanced into greater development, we could shift that and find a way to potentially better utilize that. One thing to note with the typical sections here is you can kind of see the outline of our existing curbs. And that's just there as a reference for you to kind of understand how the road is expanding or being reduced. So concept 1A, Baltimore Avenue West. Again, this really helps to demonstrate the expansion of the right-of-way as we move from west to east. You'll also note we've highlighted the pedestrian circulation path that would be provided, and as well as driveways and no parking areas. The bike facility shows up in our legend here, but it's not a part of this concept. That shows up later in some of our other concepts. And then concept 1A, Baltimore Avenue East. Again, you guys are welcome to review these at later task force meetings. I'm just going to brush through them pretty quickly, but want to highlight a few things for you. So concept 1A on Wilmington Avenue, very similar to Baltimore Avenue. And this is Wilmington Avenue West. Again, you can see the no parking areas highlighted in gray, and Wilmington Avenue East. So as we get closer to the east section of both Baltimore and Wilmington Avenues, what remains is a larger area, a broader area for sidewalk, but then also the accommodation of parking. Concept 1A, First Street. So because we are looking at expanding the pedestrian circulation path and expanding the through lanes to meet those minimum 10-foot widths, we end up losing parking on First Street. And as you can see, that extends in the vicinity of Baltimore Avenue as well as Wilmington Avenue. And then concept 1A on 2nd Street really isn't a wholesale change from what's out there today. We have tightened up the one through lane that's southbound to be 10 feet. what we would do at a later date is make sure that that doesn't constrain the intersection there at 2nd Street in Wilmington for larger vehicles turning. But that expands the pedestrian circulation path as well. So concept 1B provides a similar pedestrian enhancement as concept 1A. The pedestrian circulation paths in some areas are less than the desired 8-foot widths, and this is due to right-of-way constraints. We provide a 5-foot bike lane on Baltimore and Wilmington Avenues, and then a shared roadway on 1st and 2nd Streets. That includes the 4-foot striped shoulder with a 10-foot travel and turn lane due to right-of-way constraints. On 1st Street, this is compatible or most compatible with the Rehoboth pedestrian and bicycle plan of 2012. So essentially on Baltimore Avenue, what this allows us to do is actually expand the pedestrian circulation path even further, because if you'll recall in concept 1A, this section of Baltimore Avenue, there was a 7-foot kind of undelineated area between the through lane and the pedestrian circulation path. Well, here we've just taken those additional 2 feet on either side and handed those over to the pedestrian circulation path. Again, as the concept's further developed, that can be refined a bit, but just to give you a quick overview of kind of what that looks like. Baltimore Avenue West. So here in purple, you can see the bicycle facility that would be provided. You can see no parking areas, but then you also see that the bike facility is immediately beside the travel lanes. So certainly that affects our parking to a far greater extent, at least on the westmost side of Baltimore Avenue. And then Baltimore Avenue East. Again, we're continuing the bike facility all the way to the beach. This is certainly the most impactful of our concepts to parking, but your benefits are also the bicycle facility. Wilmington Avenue is similar in layout compared to Baltimore Avenue. So I won't spend a whole lot of time here, but again, you can see the parking area impacts and the no parking areas. Wilmington Avenue East. And then on 1st Street. So on 1st Street, things get a little bit more challenging because we have that turn lane and we want to make sure that we're keeping bikers safe. And also it's worth noting, so in all of these scenarios, the bike lane is flowing in the direction of traffic. This is not a two-way bike lane. It's a one-way bike lane, but we have one in each direction. So in this situation, we've got the 4-foot stripe shoulder that's situated between the curb and the through lane. And the bike lane is provided between the through and the turn lane. We did that because we certainly don't want people making a right-hand turn to cut off a biker and cause potential conflicts there. It's also important to know that this would result in some constraint to the pedestrian circulation path if we're limiting that within the existing right-of-way. If there's some sort of agreement between the city and property owners, there's potential that that pedestrian circulation path, or at least the pedestrian circulation path plus building frontage, could extend and provide a little more circulation area. So this is concept 1B on 1st Street. Again, this concept eliminates parking, but provides that bicycle facility, both Baltimore and Wilmington Avenues. And then on 2nd Street. So 2nd Street's similar to 1st Street because of the turn lane. We've got a 4-foot stripe shoulder, a 5-foot bike lane. This certainly tightens the pedestrian circulation path. And then let's go into schematic concept 2. So schematic concept 2 expands the travel lane and parking widths to meet minimum standards, and also provides that minimum 5-foot recommended pedestrian circulation path, but it doesn't include bike facilities within the study area. Concept 2 on Baltimore Avenue, again, looking at the section nearest 2nd Street because that is the most constrained. We've got 2 10-foot through lanes, parking on either side of the street at 8 feet wide, and that provides for a 7-foot pedestrian circulation path. As we extend closer to the intersection with First Street, that pedestrian circulation path can then extend out and get wider. And you can see that here in our display. And then as we get nearer to the beach, obviously there's more space for angled parking or head-in parking. The orientation of that parking would be developed later. We'd be able to get a little bit better of an idea how the parking's being oriented. Concept 2 on Wilmington Avenue is a similar setup, similar impacts or potentially lack of impact to parking. There's less of an impact here. One thing to note is some of the conversations that we've had going out in the field and with the fire chief. There are areas where, again, the existing parking is below minimums. Potentially no parking zones would need to be expanded to accommodate those minimums. So while this is certainly the least impactive to parking, there are still parking impacts associated with the concept. So concept 2 on First Street, again, we're providing parking as there is today, 10-foot through lanes, 10-foot turn lanes, and just kind of an idea of what this does with our pedestrian circulation path. We can still provide that 5.5-foot or a 5.5-foot pedestrian circulation path here. If we extended out to the existing right-of-way, we could get an 8-foot circulation path in this zone. So overview north and south on First Street, north and south of Rehoboth Avenue, I should say. And then concept 2 on Second Street. So because the existing layout of Second Street doesn't include parking, the concept 2 on Second Street is really the same as concept 1A. Again, we've narrowed the through lanes, providing a 10-foot turn lane, and the remaining is devoted to the pedestrian circulation path. So our next steps. For the task force consideration, we want you to kind of look at these concepts, go into a deeper dive, and identify what the focus is. Who's the commercial downtown trying to attract? Who do we want to accommodate? It's important to know that we can look at a schematic recommendation that's maybe a combination of schematics. It's okay to mix and match. So maybe 1A, concept 1A works on Second Street, but the preference is for 1B to occur on First Street. Maybe Wilmington Avenue really likes concept 1A and Baltimore Avenue really likes 1B or 2, whatever the situation may be. That's okay, but we are asking that there's a continuity within the corridor, because you certainly don't want to set a user expectation, whether that's bikes or peds or even vehicles in some cases, and suddenly change that. That can cause potential conflicts. The other thing to consider when you're looking at schematics is pedestrian generators. Where are the walk-up windows, the outdoor dining, and the shopping? Also, where are your bike use generators? Where are bike shops and rentals? And we've actually labeled those facilities or those businesses on the displays. So when the task force is kind of reviewing these, you can zoom in on the PDF. We're going to be providing an updated PDF to the city so that they can do that. And then the other thing to consider is, you know, as the city continues to consider utility undergrounding, but the placement of those transformers and how that works within the overall streetscape layout and provides for potentially impacting sidewalk areas. Also for consideration, concept 1B on First Street is the most compatible with that comprehensive development plan from 2010 and the pedestrian and bike plan from 2012. And parking impacts haven't been quantified, but as we saw going through the displays, concept 1B would have the greatest impact on parking. And so with the task force consideration, based on your next recommendations, Rossi Group's going to take that concept, that development, and further refine it. We're going to further consider the limited vehicle access zones, intersections, and crosswalks, utilization of the pedestrian circulation path, And we also have a request for the city to discuss right-of-way versus building facade. We'll get into that a little bit here. So the feasibility of the limited access zones, again, per the recommendation of the task force previously and the commissioner's approval, we're only looking at the first 2 blocks of Wilmington and Baltimore Avenues nearest the beach. We're looking at options to expand the pedestrian amenities, but we also need to make sure that we're accommodating for emergency access and deliveries and providing drop-off locations. In the area of Baltimore Avenue, we also need to make sure that that's compatible with the ongoing beach patrol improvements that are being in design. The other thing that we'll be looking at in draft concept development are intersections and crosswalks. So ways that we can increase the pedestrian safety, increase crosswalk visibility. We'll consider bump outs where appropriate, but we also need to make sure that anything that we're doing in the vicinity of intersections is going to provide for that turning radius for large vehicles. And then the other thing that we'll be taking a deeper dive into is the utilization of the pedestrian circulation path. So we'll define the pedestrian access route, integrating bump outs, and looking at how these interact with driveways and fire lanes. The other thing worth considering is the right-of-way versus the building facade, in particular on First Street. You can see that in the detailed image here of First Street. So those building facades, obviously that's outside of the existing right-of-way. That's where the planners are, the signages are, and things like that. The city, we want them to discuss potential agreements with individual property owners. So right-of-way acquisition is not something that's within DelDOT's purview under the TAP program, or it's generally just not done. An overview of our schedule, we're here, it's May 26th. Our intent is to finalize our report in November. We've got a public meeting tentatively scheduled in September. So our next presentation is going to be in July. Decision points and dates, that means that we're asking the task force to identify the schematic concept for draft concept development. And I've got a reference here to the specific slides for you guys. Like I said, it's a lot of material, but we're asking for that by June 11th. That gives us enough time on our end to focus on our draft concept development. And then we'll be presenting that in July. So I've reached the end of the bulk of my presentation, but I did want to highlight some things again from a utility standpoint, just at the request of the city. Again, this is the same slide we saw before. The city had the conversation with Delmarva Power about transformers, how many might be required. So it's important to know when we're considering utility undergrounding, what those transformer sizes are. Generally, Delmarva prefers that they're located on private property next to the existing right-of-way. The reason for the next to existing right-of-way is that they can be accessed for repair should anything happen. But if it's within 10 feet of the roadway, the driving section of the roadway, protection's needed, and that's just to prevent potential accidents. And then light poles and wireless antennas are required along the routes. So with those items in mind, what we did was essentially cited the recommended or suggested number of transformers within our concept 1B layout. This is really for conversation purposes to kind of give you an idea of what accommodations might be required. If you zoom in on this image, you can also see the existing utility poles and the utility poles with transformers. Particularly in the area of access, you can see how that transformer location would potentially cause or would require some sort of bump out, some sort of accommodation, either for the transformer or for the sidewalk pedestrian access route. So these are kind of things that would have to be dove into at a later date, but certainly something to consider. Needless to say, the more that we're putting in the sidewalk, the wider the space for the sidewalk needs to become. So also for note, just these potential transformer locations, we've chosen an 8 to 7 foot size for those, and that's just, or 8 by 7 foot size. And that's just because that's kind of an in-between the smallest and the largest facilities that we were able to research. So this is essentially what utility undergrounding might look like for concept 1B on Baltimore Avenue East. Again, you see in front of the Lord Baltimore Lodge, there would be a requirement for something to accommodate the pedestrian circulation path. How we accommodate that would have to be considered as the concept is developed and moved forward. But again, that transformer may shift in location. You know, maybe the utility designer can better accommodate the transformers or condense their locations too. Utility undergrounding, concept 1B, Wilmington Avenue, and then Wilmington Avenue East. So, and this was the section that, if you'll recall, there was a recommendation based on the conversation with Delmarva that there would have to be 7 transformers here. And I think that's because of the density of commercial buildings in this area. And that is all the information that we have to share with you all today. Happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Alexis. Very helpful. You've done a lot of work, you and Rita. We appreciate it. I just wanted to make a few comments before we open it up for any questions. One is, you know, when you mentioned undergrounding and the transformers, pad mount and everything, I just want to remind you that we have Mike Strange. I don't know if he's on or not, but at a previous meeting, he indicated, recommended the suggestion of looking for hardened underground vaults so that everything could be placed underground. So maybe that's something that we can, I'm sure the price skyrockets for that, and maybe make it exorbitant and impossible to do the project, but maybe that's something that we can get our consultants for undergrounding to take a look at. Kevin, what is the status of an underground consultant? Have we reached out yet, or that's something in the works?
No, Mayor, not yet. We wanted to get the consensus actually from the group and see where we are after Alexis's presentation today.
So you'd like?
Well, just some feedback. I mean, you know, we've been tasked with it, and certainly we're going to follow through with that. But in order to, you know, proceed, I thought there'd be some discussion if anyone has any interest in doing that.
There can be. We can make that part of our conversation. You know, one of the comments earlier was we make undergrounding #1 priority. So the question would be whether this presentation today has made anybody change their mind. Again, what we said is undergrounding would be a #1 priority, and that we would continue to pursue it until we found that it was not possible or viable project. So that would still be my position. But before we go to that, let me see if there's any other questions. Construction.
Mayor, I have a question.
I think how maybe we should approach this is, let's ask questions while we've got Rossi on the camera here with us. Ask questions that help us on how we're going to evaluate this on an individual basis. Who was that? Commissioner Calusi? Yeah.
I was just didn't the commissioners decide to move forward with the study for the underground utility? Is this committee in a position to decide that we shouldn't do that? Is that where we're going with this? I just want to understand.
No, I think we already have given, this committee, I think, has given marching orders, and I think the commissioners, by reacting at one of those meetings where they adopted the slate of all the recommendations by this committee, I think the marching orders are very clear, and that we should go ahead and hire that undergrounding consultant.
Okay, thank
And
you.
that's fine, Mayor. Again, just waiting for this meeting to conclude, and we'll get right on that.
Sounds good. So, any questions? You know, one of the things I'm doing, looking through this, I'm going, wow, this is a lot of information to absorb. You know, I certainly am not going to be able to say I know which concept I want at the end of this meeting and I'm going to vote for it. I definitely need consideration. So in part of listening to this, I'm trying to evaluate, you know, how am I going to evaluate it? I'm going to look at the individual components. You know, I'm going to look at the sidewalk width. I put a lot of weight on the width of the sidewalk for pedestrians. At the same time, I put a lot of weight on parking and preserving parking rather than losing parking. So that gives me a certain direction. I'm looking at the travel lanes and the number of travel lanes. And what is called bicycle facilities. I was thinking bicycle facilities meant our little bicycle parking stations. And I think bicycle facility stations really means routing and up and down the street. So I'm just sharing with you how I intend to take a look at some of these things. I would like to note that within the CDP, it indicates that we will take a look at removal or elimination of the parking on the west side of First Street. And if you remember, the CDP is a guide for further consideration. It wasn't a dictate. So we're glad to see that Rossi took a look at that and provided an option that addressed that. But again, it's not a dictate in the CDP. It's a recommendation that warrants further investigation. So if anybody has further questions of Rossi while we've got them, so that we can clarify any slides or concepts, so that after this meeting, it enables you to go back and study and evaluate of everything. Let's ask those questions now. Commissioner Cluzy?
Yes. So this somewhat involves Rossi, but after looking at this in detail prior to this meeting and of course during this meeting, listening to the presentation, I can't help but understand that this begs the need for a traffic study, maybe not for the whole city, but for that immediate area, because I think it could change the ability to have parking and perhaps a bike lane and enhanced pedestrian access as well. So I'm wondering, given where we are with this and what would be involved in a traffic study for the immediate area, whether something could be accomplished in the short term, perhaps not, but I just feel like this is such a huge decision in terms of what we choose. I would like, I guess, an answer to that question or a recommendation or understanding how the rest of this committee feels.
Well, you know, we can second guess everything, just like undergrounding, the traffic study. We've made recommendations to not conduct a traffic study. That was passed on to the commissioners, and the Board of Commissioners unanimously adopted those recommendations. So I'm really hesitant to go backwards, I guess.
I believe that if it was adopted, that we would lose this ability to have Rossi Group move forward with this with this analysis. Am I incorrect in that?
Sharon?
I don't think so.
I don't think so, but
Okay.
well, if anybody else has an opinion, they can certainly share it.
Okay. Thank you.
I would like to make mention of one other thing, you know, and that is that Rossi mentions the limited vehicle access zones at the end of Wilmington and Baltimore. And want to make sure that Rossi understands that my recollection from this committee was that we recommended investigation of those. We weren't dictating that they happen. Because it could happen on one street and not the other and vice versa, or it may not happen at all, or it may happen on both. So that was not a dictate, and I wanted to share that with you. Also, I wanted to remind everybody, I think we've mentioned it before, that design is underway for major renovations at the Baltimore Avenue Beach Patrol building, which also incorporates the restroom facilities there, men's room, women's restroom, and Beach Patrol building. And what's being designed there is to accommodate enlarging the men's room, the women's restrooms, adding changing rooms, adding family-size restroom facilities, but also enlarging the Beach Patrol building by adding a second floor to that building. And to do that, the designers have come out 5 to 10 feet, consuming the end of Baltimore Avenue. So just FYI, and I'm sure Rossi knows about that, and I'm sure Kevin's passed that on, but just for the rest of us, the end of the street there is, regardless of what happens here, is contemplated to be shortened a little bit after we check, I guess, fire codes and feasibility to accommodate enlarging and major renovations at that Beach Patrol and restroom facility. Are there any more questions that we want to ask for Rossi so that we can better learn how to evaluate all these things? We've got Howard Menaker.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm trying to wrap my head around all of the variations and all of the concepts. And just so that I make sure I'm not completely misunderstanding, as I understand it, we know that Baltimore and Wilmington, the public right-of-way widens as we get closer to the beach. And I think what I saw was that in all of the iterations from Rossi, using that expansiveness, we could get, I guess, wider sidewalks as well as wider travel lanes closer to the beach as opposed to back at First and Second. Is that a correct concept, or did I look at those drawings right?
I think what we see, and Howard, please correct me if I'm misinterpreting your question, but what we've provided is wider sidewalks. We've also provided the consistent travel lane. So the travel lane remains at 10 feet from one end to the other. And then the parking expands out. So the typical section that we showed you is really the string line of the area closest to 2nd Street. Obviously that changes as you move forward. As the shoulder area, or not really shoulder area, but as the additional space widens out, we would look at providing parking in those areas. The parking would obviously have to be appropriate to what width is available. So that's where the minimum recommendations come in. I think it's 8 foot for parallel parking. If I recall, 18 feet for head-in parking, and 18 feet also for the angle parking. So we're still providing parking. We're not necessarily expanding sidewalk and travel lanes throughout and eliminating parking throughout. But we are looking at existing areas where the parking doesn't meet those minimum requirements, and that's based on DelDOT and city code. And we haven't defined those as parking spaces. It doesn't necessarily mean that at a later date it couldn't be accepted and somehow or another accommodated that way. Or maybe those are the areas that you look at the scooter parking or the bike parking.
Yeah, thank you. That is helpful. It was a little hard to grasp all the detail, and we've got a lot of study to do. And Mayor, as long as I'm thinking about this, I would simply say that looking at these alternatives makes me feel even more than ever that undergrounding utilities remains our top priority. I was actually very encouraged by looking at the drawings to see how few transformers will be needed in some blocks. And I would think that when we retain a consultant to talk about undergrounding utilities, as you mentioned, I would like for them to really study the feasibility of the underground vaults from an engineering standpoint. The cost standpoint, that'll be up to the mayor and commissioners. But I think if we get a good idea, it really changes the way that those sidewalks, the pedestrian access and the bike access can be influenced. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Howard. I wanted to piggyback real quick before we go to Frank Cooper next, and then Jenny, and then Frank Cole. You know, I also took a look at the right-of-way width up near 2nd Street. It's what, 51-ish feet, and 100, I'd say double that down near the boardwalk area. And I'd wondered if Rossi was going to give any thought to changing the width of the right-of-way or the travel area of the roadway to a much narrower. In other words, I'm sorry, widening the sidewalks from, say, 1st Street, that might be 8 feet wide at 1st Street, but go to 10 feet, 12 feet, 15 feet wide down toward the boardwalk. And it may not seem that important on Baltimore, but Wilmington certainly gets a lot more traffic, and wider sidewalks closer to the boardwalk might be interesting. So I don't know if that was ever looked at by Rossi.
So yeah, I think if you look at the displays that were drawn up, you can see how that sidewalk area, the pedestrian circulation path, is widening out. If you like, I can pull that up real quick. Let me share that with you. And again, I recognize that there's a lot of information here. So let's see if I can easily share. Okay, are you seeing my screen now?
Nope, not yet.
Not yet. Okay.
Okay.
So as you can see here, and the pedestrian circulation path is noted by the yellow line. As it expands towards the beach, obviously we're widening out.
Okay.
You know, the other thing to consider is what we've tried to do here is provide adequate parking. So the width of the sidewalk here is being dictated on still providing an appropriate depth for that head-end parking as well.
Very good, very good. Thank you. Frank Cooper, please. Frank, you're muted. Start over.
Excuse me. I have a question. I'm not sure, but probably it's for Sharon Lynn. Do we have any design drawings for the new building, the new lifeguards building, and what it will look like and what it will, where it will be exactly? Because we're making decisions about access from the beach to the street, which I think everybody's identified as important to facilitate people from the boardwalk onto the sidewalks. And since that's changing, I think we need that to kind of, before we make any decisions about what we're doing with that street. So if those drawings or some limited representation, just so we have some idea of what we're talking about. It's going to be 2 stories. That's going to be radically different.
Yeah, Frank, we do have some schematics, and the contractor still working on that, and certainly can share that with Alexis and her team.
Okay, great. That would be very helpful, I think, when we're making decisions, especially aesthetic decisions.
I think, and I'm sorry to interject, so the draft plans have been shared with us, and certainly we've looked at those, but I think that the decision on the schematic concept, we're really looking at kind of that profile. Obviously the connection there at the boardwalk side is very important, but we're really in concept development right now, and that is a further degree of design. So obviously the beach patrol is advancing prior to this, and whatever is determined there, we would have to tie into.
Very good. Thank you. Anything else, Frank?
Just a comment on the bicycles. As anyone knows me knows that it's my primary form of transportation in the city. But honestly, I don't see where bike lanes are really feasible. If you're talking about taking out parking, I don't think that's going to fly with the businesses there. And personally, I don't think they're necessary. The traffic there is very slow. On First Street, Second Street, very tight, hard for bicycles. But from my personal experience, Baltimore Avenue and Wilmington Avenue, the traffic's so slow that the bikes just use the regular traffic lanes very successfully. And I think it's more about parking for bicycles near businesses, near restaurants is a better use of the space than a dedicated bicycle lane. That's just my anecdotal observation.
Thank you, Frank. Again, let's focus as much as we can while we've got Rossi on here with any questions to help us evaluate it. We've got 2 more meetings after this that we can provide our opinions and comments on. Jen Burton, you're next, then Frank Cole, then Alex Moore.
So I just, I don't have a question for Alexis, but I just wanted to comment, piggyback off of Frank Cooper. I feel like the bike lane is a waste because I feel like now, being downtown every day, bikes and scooters pretty much go with the traffic. Without having the traffic study, I wanted to say that to Alexis, that they pretty much go with the traffic when it's super, super busy, August 15th. But in the wintertime, fall, we have a lot of bikers, a lot of scooters, and they pretty much kind of go in the direction they're going and they go slow. But I feel like there's a better use for that space. The other thing I wanted to comment about was I saw that we have lots of projects. The Bellhaven on Wilmington, the Scirocco has been bought. So, you know, that whole end. And also I understand there's going to be a renovation at the Atlantic Sands where Jam is and all that. None of that is in the original schematic plans that we've looked at today. I just wanted to comment that if the Papa John family does the Bellhaven on Wilmington and it's going to be done within the next couple years, and then this project is in 3 years, like what they do would be, we need to like incorporate what they're doing and we're doing at the same time. I feel like it would be a waste. And then the other thing I had a question about is there was a comment regarding, you know, the cost of undergrounding, the expense of undergrounding these transformers. If it's so exorbitantly expensive to do that, I mean, it's not, I'm either way, I'm fine, but does it shift our plan or any of these schematic plans if we choose, because of the cost of it, would it change or shift our schematic plan? So when it comes time to get these quotes or a budget per se, undergrounding versus putting these pads and having it above ground versus having, you know, obviously poles. So I just had that question, would it really change the design, really? That's it.
Thank you, Jenny. And when it comes to these projects, we have yet to decide who will dictate what the streetscape concept is. For instance, when Bellhaven goes forward, we may be at the point where we dictate that they need to conform with our streetscape design. And I would say likely that's how it would be. Alex Moore has more experience with it, with the Avenue Inn, where we had no streetscape concept, and they actually presented it, and it was a gorgeous, beautiful design, and that's what was implemented. But ideally, perhaps the norm would be that streetscape is designed by the city, and the new development has to conform. Next, we'll go to, we got Frank Cole, and then Alex Moore, and then David Mariner. Frank?
I have 4 questions that came up with, and they have to do with the underlying assumptions behind the different proposed schematics. And Alexis or Rossi could answer these, or we could just keep them in mind for future discussion amongst the committee. But my first question about the underlying assumptions is, does more bike lanes and continuity necessarily mean more bikes? The second question, does more bikes mean fewer cars? The third, does fewer parking spots mean fewer cars? Or does it mean that you're going to have more cars circulating around looking to find a parking space? And lastly, to touch on Frank Cooper's point, is it a good idea to have a bike lane on a dead end street where the only means of egress is the same way that you came in? And I tend to side with Frank Cooper and Jen Burton on that one, that perhaps a bike lane on Wilmington or Baltimore Avenue needs to be thought over a little bit more closely, because people generally ride in the street and they go with the flow of traffic, and there don't seem to be any problems there. So those are my 4 questions that have to do with the underlying assumptions behind each one of the proposed schematics.
Very good questions. Rossi, do you want to respond to any, or do you want us to let us have time to contemplate those?
I think that they're good questions. I don't think that there was an assumption made on our end in developing. Again, we wanted to make sure that we were presenting some variety of concept, but certainly good things to consider, especially as the task force mulls over the different concepts and the potential benefits and challenges with each.
Very good. Frank, would you type up your questions and send them to me? I'd like to distribute them to everybody. I think it'd be very helpful. Anything else, Frank Cole?
Nope, that's it. I'll type them up, Mr. Mayor, and forward them over to you via email.
Good. Thank you very much, Frank. Alex Moore, and then David Mariner and Joe Baker.
My question's around the transformers, and did Rossi consider the opportunities for bump outs into the street? Recognizing you need the bollards to protect them, but did we consider bump outs as opposed to being on private property, which I could see being I noticed one in front of the beach view, which I know would be a real challenge for a building that's already existing to the property line, right to the sidewalk. So just want to know if I see that as a really big hurdle to get. If you have new construction, it works, because we did that at the Avenue. We were forced to put a transformer on our property, but with existing buildings, that's going to be a real challenge. So bump outs seem to be an answer to me if that's an opportunity.
Bump outs absolutely are. So, I'm sorry, the one display, or the series of displays at the end. So we've essentially placed those transformers with the understanding, I think you can see that the pedestrian circulation paths in certain locations at least are inadequate. Bump outs would have to be considered to accommodate for that pedestrian circulation. But again, looking into a deeper dive into the engineering, I think, is required to really understand, okay, where specifically, do these transformers need to be located? Can they be shifted? Can they be clustered? In a whole variety of questions that would have to be asked. And it sounds like the city is pursuing that.
Thank you.
Yeah, that would be, I think, the intent of hiring the engineering consultant for undergrounding, somebody that, and it would be somebody that has experience in undergrounding other towns to work with Rossi on that. If you recall, I mentioned it for Lake Avenue Phase 1. That's the Lake Avenue area between Bad Hair Day and Culture Pearl that was accomplished a few years ago. The downfall of undergrounding there, frankly, was that most of the transformers needed to be put on private property, and there was no one willing to allow us to do that. So that's where, Alex, I think we definitely need to have this consultant on board to see whether bump outs can achieve that. I was especially alarmed to see the one data sheet that indicated that you have all the transformers in all these locations, but for on North First Street. So obviously we would accomplish that.
If I could just add, I think that, bump outs are a good opportunity also for landscaping. You maybe wouldn't do it just for the size of the transformer, but it breaks up the look of the street as opposed to just a corridor of parked cars, especially, at our end of Wilmington, on the east end of Wilmington, where, both sides of the road are just parked cars, not particularly appealing. So it gives you that opportunity. And maybe that's a place where these crazy 5G poles and 6G poles or whatever are becoming, have an opportunity to be as well. Lose parking, but I think the aesthetic value is a big gain. Thanks.
Definitely. Thank you very much. David Mariner and then Joe Baker.
Hi, my question is more just to understand what I'm looking at. So I apologize if I'm not picking this up quite fast enough, but I'm looking at the green dots that are the potential transformer locations in the underground plan. And I'm just wondering, how do they relate to like the current power boxes that are on the streets?
So David, if you look at, I think the display that you're looking at right now that's showing the transformers, the existing poles or the existing utility lines, they're shown as black dots, and then existing power lines with transformers, they've got a small T next to them. So does that help?
Yeah, no, I understood that part. I guess my question is, so there's a potential transformer outside of Atlantique or outside of camp. Is that in addition to the one that we currently have, or is that in lieu of the one that
would be in lieu? Yeah, that would be in lieu of. So really what we wanted to show was kind of where those existing transformers are. And then the idea being that if we eliminate the existing, this is where the potential proposed, but I wouldn't even go so far as to use the word proposed. I think it's just kind of a visual aid, for lack of a better word.
Okay, and then do you think it would be the same size, or we just don't know that right
now? We just don't know that right now. Again, when I cited those transformer locations, we used a dimension of 8 by 7 feet, just because that's in between kind of the general 6 by 4 and 10 by 8 that we found as kind of typical sizes.
Yeah, I don't know the other blocks as well as I know our block, but it doesn't look hugely different than what we currently have, unless the sizes are going to be very different.
And so what we've shown are essentially areas for those surface mounted transformers. If you're continuing to explore something that would be the serious undergrounding where you're talking about bolts and things like that, it would obviously look different, but that's part of that other next step, I guess.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, not a problem.
Thank you, David. Joe Baker, please.
Yeah, I just might be jumping ahead towards some more detailed design elements, but is it fair to assume with all the concepts that we'll be able to add more bike racks once this is done, or is there one concept that would accommodate that better, more, the wider sidewalks? I think we're welcoming more bike traffic in town with the expansion of Rehoboth Avenue extended and the bike lanes. And I agree also that I think the bike lanes are not too feasible in this design. But as far as bike racks, just, there's in the summer, people are blocking bikes up to poles and signs and all of that. And I just want to know if, what we should consider there as far as the down the road, the design of adding more bike racks in. Or maybe that would even be with the bump outs like Alex is discussing.
Potentially the specific locations, how those bike racks are accommodated, whether or not they're located in bump outs, whether or not no parking areas are okay to accommodate bikes instead. These are all things that would have to be considered as the development of the concept rolled forward.
But they are very important and will be part of the conversation. I'll go to Frank Cooper, and then I want to go to the public. Go ahead, Frank.
Yes, I had a question for Alexis. On most of these plans, they have the buffer zone between the sidewalk and the street. And we call it tree strips, I think, although there's very few trees in it. And I kind of wanted to focus on whether they are necessary for the entire length of the street, as opposed to what Alex Moore was talking about, where you have bump outs, where we could have trees in bump outs and then absorb that buffer space into sidewalk space to widen the sidewalk. Is that possible? Is that not code? And could you put bicycle parking parallel to the street in those areas?
So for this schematic development, what we have essentially referred to as the pedestrian circulation path. And if you refer back to the one kind of snapshot we had that was taken from one of DelDOT's manuals, so that pedestrian circulation path includes what's called the buffer area, which could be where things like, obviously your parking pay stations are located, trees, benches, light poles, signage, and potentially that bike parking can all be located in that. And just because we have kind of our schematic draws a straight line, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a straight line later as we further develop this. Maybe, you know, consideration can be given for bump outs and things like that. What we're looking at with the schematic or with the concept development in our next stage is really where we're locating the PAR, and that's the pedestrian access route. And that, so we're referring to the 4-foot minimum for that width. That's the clear zone to make sure that people can actually walk. And we'll be locating the PAR, and based on where we can locate the PAR, then we get a little more flexibility with what that buffer looks like, but also the frontage zones on the buildings. I don't know if I've answered your question or provided a little more confusion. You're on mute though, Franken.
Yes, you've essentially answered it, that there's so many things that can go into that there's no answer to it. So that's fine. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Frank. With that, I don't see any more questions from the task force members. I'd like to go to the members of the public so that we can seek their feedback. Dr. Michael Trejos, are you available? Is he on? Dr. Trejos, you're either unmuted or you're not available right now. We'll come back to you. How about Mike Strange?
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Okay, yes.
Is this Mike?
Yeah, it's Mike Strange.
Yes, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, I'd like to make a couple of observations and thank you for Alex's presentation. It did get out prior to the meeting, and so I did review it in detail, and I'd like a couple of comments. Is that the two streets in question, particularly the first block of Baltimore and Wilmington, in transportation terms are in basically F, failure mode most of the year during the summer, especially. And with that in mind, because everything is so slow on those streets, I would observe that the bike lanes are absolutely not necessary. The other part, though, is from the standpoint I'd like everyone to consider is from the standpoint of undergrounding utilities, regardless of whether there are bump outs or not, which become an aesthetic consideration, or whether they're put in vaults underground, is the fact that this is for the long term. And just as Kevin William knows, with our ocean outfall project, we made that a larger diameter, which costs virtually nil, only about $500,000. So it would accommodate growth for the next 50 years. In the case of this streetscape project, with regard to the undergrounding of utilities, it's going to be there for 50 years. The expense is the actual initialization of doing it. And the same thing was true with our ocean outfall project. All the money was for the digging everything up and putting everything down, and increasing the scale of it was de minimis. The other part is in the analysis that was done by Rossi, one of the things that is missing and is a very, I don't want to say a serious flaw, but it's a consideration that affects everything else. The boardwalk is the largest singular pedestrian way that we have in the city. And it abuts both of these on the east end, which has a dramatic impact on the flow of personnel that go to the commercial sections on those streets. And why that's so important is because in the CDP, it talks about commercial viability. You could implement everything that's in any of the plans currently presented by the Rossi Group, and it might have a de minimis effect on the financial viability. And the reason for that is the absolute number of feet, people that can get into the various stores that are on those streets would not dramatically increase. So to your point, Mayor Mills, and I know you don't like to eliminate any parking at all, you could actually reduce the number of parking spaces, but increase the effective number of human beings that are on those streets and going into those stores if the boardwalk was perhaps transitioned better into those two streets and draws people off of the boardwalk, because that's the largest density of human beings that are not in vehicles that can go into the various stores and restaurants that are on those streets. So I think it's something to be seriously considered. The only other comment I would make is I think that the physicality of what was presented by the Rossi Group is typical of what happens when transportation engineers are doing the analysis and not urban planners, because urban planners look at the viability of the cultural and economic considerations beyond strictly the technical engineering considerations. So you have a lot on your plate, and if there's anything I can help with, I'd be more than happy to as a citizen. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Perhaps we should introduce you next time as a citizen, as a former planner with DelDOT, as a planning commission member working on the CDP, so that we all have a better understanding of where you come from. Thank you very much, Mike. Dr. Michael Trejos, are you on yet? Apparently he's not available. If you get on later, speak up. Any other comments from the task force members? Would like to review real quick the timeline. As you say in one of the slides, Rossi mentions a timeline of June 11th is when they would like to have preferred schematics identified. Our next task force meeting will be Wednesday at 9 o'clock, June 2nd, where I expect that we'll have substantial conversation on perhaps the pros and cons of the different concepts to see if we can get closer. If we get to the point where we're able to vote on a preferred schematic at that point, fine. If not, I've also scheduled Wednesday, June 9th at 9 a.m., which would help us to meet the deadline of June 11th to get Rossi a preferred schematic. So please make sure those are on your schedule. What I would suggest is that if you have questions, if you would send them to me, I'll compile them. We'll make sure Rossi has them in advance. If we can answer them ahead of the meeting, we'll try to do that because we want to be able to be proficient at our next meeting. And again, when we tried to decide a path forward, Rossi indicated that we didn't have to have the same concept for every block, that it could be varied. So that can certainly enter into our conversation. I'd like to offer Rossi any more opportunity to comment. Oh, you're good. Thank you. Thank you, Alexis. Thank you, Rita. We appreciate all your efforts in this. City staff, do you have any comments you'd like to offer? They're shaking their head no. Any other comments from the task force? Frank, you're contemplating. Okay, Frank, go ahead.
One question
Frank
for
Cooper.
Sharon Lynn. She was hesitant to hire a consultant for the undergrounding without knowing what we were going to do. If you can comment about what you would want from the task force as far as direction goes, because I know you're going to be in a position where you're going to call this consultant up and ask him to do something, but you don't really have, it's at the mercy of a bunch of citizens and whatnot. So what
Frank, we already resolved that earlier. We indicated that there's no reason to pause. This task force made a recommendation that the undergrounding is a priority. The Board of Commissioners adopted that, and so we earlier gave her marching orders.
Yeah, okay, well.
All right, anything else from the task force? Whew, we got a lot covered. We'll do our best for the next meeting. If you have any questions, certainly contact me. And if you have any questions for Rossi, please send them over too, so we can make one big compilation and we can see where questions might overlap, and then try to get them back to you or have them addressed at our next meeting. With that, I want to thank everybody, and including Rossi Group and our city staff, and adjourn this meeting at 10:29 p.m. Thank you very much.